The wind howled through the narrow alleys of San Lorenzo that October evening, carrying with it the bitter chill of autumn and the faint echo of laughter spilling from the crumbling doorways of abandoned buildings. Rome had a darker side, one tourists never saw, and it was here, in the forgotten quarters of the city, that 17-year-old Emily Turner's story began to unravel. Emily was young, with her whole life ahead of her, but her path had already been riddled with storms. Her parents had split years earlier, leaving her caught between fractured worlds. At school she had been bright, curious and eager to be seen, but outside of it, loneliness often wrapped around her like a cloak. She craved belonging, and that hunger drew her into circles she should never have stepped into. On the evening of October 18, 2018, Emily told her grandmother she was heading out to meet friends. She left with a small bag slung across her shoulder, her phone buzzing with half-hearted notifications, and a restless energy in her chest. She did not return. That night became the beginning of a nightmare. The streets of San Lorenzo were buzzing with a different kind of life than the rest of Rome. While tourists roamed the Colosseum, this district hid in the shadows, its alleys filled with addicts, dealers and those trying to disappear. Emily found herself near an old abandoned building that locals whispered about. Broken windows stared down like hollow eyes, and its stairwell smelled of damp concrete and burnt chemicals. It was there that she crossed paths with men who saw her vulnerability as prey. Witnesses would later recall seeing a young girl, thin, with blonde hair, wandering nervously through the neighborhood. She looked out of place like a sparrow trapped among vultures. Some said she seemed lost, others claimed she was searching for something, or someone. But what remained certain was that Emily walked into the clutches of three men who would turn her night into unspeakable horror. Inside that crumbling building, shadows swallowed her. She had texted a friend earlier, short, anxious messages, pleas that went unanswered. Her phone later pinged cell towers, showing erratic movement before suddenly going silent. The building's graffiti-covered walls had heard countless screams before, but none as desperate as Emily's. The men gave her drugs, a cocktail potent enough to blur her mind and paralyze her body. Her small frame could not fight it. Her limbs grew heavy, her voice cracked into whispers. What followed was a series of brutal acts that stripped away her innocence, her strength, her life. They left her in the cold, broken, her final breaths shallow and uneven, her eyes staring into the black void of the ceiling above. By morning, her body was discovered. Wrapped in a blanket, she lay curled like a child, abandoned in the shadows of San Lorenzo. It was a haunting sight, her pale skin against the rough floor, the silence pressing down as though the world itself mourned what had been stolen. News spread quickly. A 17-year-old girl, lifeless, discarded in an abandoned building in the heart of Rome. The details were grim. Her family was shattered. Her grandmother, the one who had raised her, collapsed in disbelief. She was just a child, she sobbed, clutching photographs of Emily's bright smile, unable to reconcile that the girl in those pictures was the same girl the police now described. Investigators swarmed the area, combing through evidence. They found syringes, empty bottles, torn fabric. Neighbors spoke of strange noises that night, shouts, muffled cries, doors slamming, but in a neighborhood so accustomed to chaos, no one intervened. The men who had trapped Emily slipped into the darkness, believing they had erased their crime. But the city does not stay silent forever. Whispers began circulating. Names, faces, fragments of truth. People who had seen too much began to talk. The police closed in on suspects, immigrants and locals tied to the drug trade, men with violent pasts. As investigators pieced together the timeline, Emily's story unfolded like a nightmare tapestry. She had not stumbled into danger by chance. She had been lured, cornered, and used until there was nothing left of her but silence. And yet, even as Rome mourned, the full scale of her suffering was only beginning to emerge. Because beneath the headlines, behind the courtroom doors that would later open, the truth of what happened to Emily Turner that night would shake the nation to its core. Her story was not just about one girl's death. It was about the predators who hunted her, the indifference of a city that looked away, and the fight for justice that would pit truth against shadows. Emily's mask of innocence had cracked the moment she stepped into San Lorenzo, but the cracks were not hers to bear alone. They belonged to a society that had failed her, and to the men who thought they could bury their sins in darkness. And this was only the beginning. The news of Emily Turner's death spread like wildfire, igniting anger, grief, and disbelief across Rome. For days, newspapers carried her photograph. A bright-eyed 17-year-old with a shy smile, her innocence now forever etched against the backdrop of tragedy. Her story was no longer just about a missing girl, It was about a brutal crime that forced the entire city to confront its shadows. Detectives from the Rome Police Department worked around the clock, determined not to let Emily's case become another unsolved statistic in San Lorenzo's long history of violence. They retraced her final steps, combing through CCTV footage from nearby streets, questioning residents and collecting evidence from the decrepit building where her body was found. What they uncovered painted a chilling picture of the night she disappeared. Emily had been seen in the company of 3 men, strangers to her family but well known to the police. They were small-time criminals with a history of drug use, theft and violent behavior. Locals whispered about them in hushed tones, describing them as predators who lurked in the neighborhood, preying on the vulnerable. One witness, a street vendor who worked late into the night, claimed he saw Emily being led into the abandoned building. "She didn't look right," he told investigators. "Her steps were unsteady and those men, they had this look in their eyes. Like wolves circling prey." Forensic teams uncovered syringes near Emily's body, along with chemical residues that pointed to a mix of heroin and benzodiazepines. The drugs in her system were strong enough to incapacitate her completely. It was a calculated move by her attackers, designed to ensure she could not fight back. The cruelty of it all shocked even seasoned detectives. The investigation intensified. Within a week, police arrested 3 men: Marco Ricci, a 36-year-old drifter with a violent past; Antonio De Luca, 32, known for dealing drugs in San Lorenzo; and Khalid Mansour, 27, a migrant with prior charges of assault. Their mugshots plastered headlines, each face carrying a smug defiance that infuriated the public. But capturing them was only the beginning. The suspects denied everything, spinning elaborate lies to distance themselves from the crime. Marco claimed he was nowhere near the building that night. Antonio insisted he had only crossed paths with Emily briefly, offering her drugs but never seeing her again. Khalid said he didn't even know her. Yet, behind their denials, the evidence grew heavier. DNA traces matched 2 of the men. A bloodstain on Marco's jacket linked him directly to Emily. Witnesses placed Antonio at the scene, while Khalid's phone records showed he was in the area at the exact time Emily's phone stopped transmitting signals. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to take shape. Emily's family attended every hearing, their grief visible to all. Her grandmother, frail but determined, sat clutching a rosary, her eyes fixed on the men accused of stealing her granddaughter's life. "She was my world," she whispered to a reporter outside the courthouse. "And they destroyed her." Public outrage swelled. Vigils were held across the city, candles flickering against the night as strangers gathered to honor Emily. Chants for justice echoed through the streets of Rome, placing immense pressure on the legal system to ensure her killers did not escape punishment. Politicians weighed in, promising reforms, while activists highlighted the broader issue of violence against women in Italy. Emily had become more than a victim. She was now a symbol of a nation's reckoning. But behind the headlines, investigators uncovered a more disturbing truth. Emily had not simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been targeted. Evidence suggested that Marco had known of her before that night, watching her movements, waiting for an opportunity. Some witnesses even suggested that Emily had been lured under the pretense of meeting friends. The chilling possibility that her death was premeditated, and not just a random act of violence, darkened the case further. During the trial's early proceedings, details emerged that horrified the courtroom. The autopsy confirmed the unimaginable cruelty Emily endured before her death. The room fell silent as the coroner described the brutality inflicted on a girl barely old enough to graduate high school. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, reporters scribbled frantically, her grandmother wept openly. The 3 accused men sat in silence, their faces betraying no remorse. Marco, in particular, seemed almost amused by the proceedings. His smirk, caught on camera, enraged the public, leading to front-page headlines branding him the monster of San Lorenzo. Prosecutors vowed to secure the maximum sentence, but defense lawyers were already preparing their strategy, challenging evidence, discrediting witnesses, and painting the men as scapegoats in a city desperate for someone to blame. The trial was shaping into a battle, one that would test the strength of Italy's justice system. For Emily's family, every day in court was torture. They sat through graphic testimonies, listened to defense attorneys twist the narrative, and endured the presence of the men accused of destroying their lives. Still, they refused to back down. "We want justice," her grandmother said firmly. "Not just for Emily but for every girl who has been silenced." As weeks turned into months, the trial grew into a national spectacle. Television stations broadcast daily updates, and talk shows debated the case endlessly. Rome was a city divided between those who demanded swift, harsh punishment and those skeptical of whether the justice system would deliver it. But beneath all the noise, one truth remained unshakable. Emily Turner was gone and nothing could bring her back. The only question left was whether her killers would pay the price, or walk free, leaving her memory to haunt the alleys of San Lorenzo forever. And as the trial deepened, new secrets would surface. Secrets that could either strengthen the case against her killers or shatter it completely. The fight for justice was far from over. The trial began in a packed courtroom, the air thick with tension and whispers. Reporters filled the benches, their pens scratching furiously against notepads, cameras clicking as if each shutter could capture the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. The prosecution sat stern-faced, while the defense wore an air of manufactured calm. The accused, seated at the defense table, avoided the gaze of the jury, his expression carefully neutral, as though carved from stone. But every so often, his eyes darted toward the gallery, searching, almost desperate. It was in those fleeting moments that his mask cracked, revealing the turmoil beneath. The judge, a seasoned man with decades on the bench, struck his gavel sharply, calling the room to order. "We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of the defendant in the murder of Emily Carter," his voice boomed. Those words seemed to echo through the silent chamber, reminding everyone that a young woman's life had been cut short, and the weight of justice now pressed down on 12 ordinary people. The prosecutor rose first. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of anger and grief as he described Emily's final hours. He spoke of her laughter, her future, the life that was ripped away by someone she trusted. He painted a picture of betrayal, of obsession, of a love that had twisted into something unrecognizable. With every word, the jury leaned closer, as if pulled into the dark web of the story. The defendant shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening, his hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Then came the witnesses. Friends of Emily testified about the controlling behavior they had witnessed, the subtle manipulation that had escalated into something far more sinister. One friend, her voice breaking, recalled the last time she saw Emily alive. "She looked scared," she said softly, tears streaking down her cheeks. "She told me she thought he was following her, that she couldn't breathe when he was around. I begged her to get help." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. The defense tried to counter, painting Emily as unstable, claiming she had exaggerated her fears, that the relationship was passionate but not dangerous. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that no one had seen the defendant commit the crime. But the prosecution had more than just testimony. They had the chilling trail of messages, the obsessive voicemails, the surveillance footage of him lingering near her apartment late at night. And they had the piece of evidence that shook the courtroom to its core, Emily's diary. When the prosecutor held it up, bound in worn leather, the jury seemed to hold their breath. Page after page revealed her terror, her pleas for it all to stop, her certainty that something terrible was coming. The final entry, written just hours before her death, read simply, "If anything happens to me, it's him." The words hung in the air like a ghost, and for the first time, the defendant's calm facade shattered. He shifted violently in his chair, muttering under his breath, his lawyer placing a hand on his arm to restrain him. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. The judge had to call for silence twice before order was restored. The jury, meanwhile, had seen enough to understand the weight of Emily's fear. They weren't looking at the evidence anymore, they were looking at the man accused of silencing her forever. But the defense wasn't finished. They brought forward their own witnesses, colleagues, distant friends, even a family member, all swearing that he was kind, gentle, incapable of such violence. They spoke of his generosity, his devotion, his steady nature. And for a moment, doubt flickered in the eyes of the jury. Could such a man really commit such a monstrous act? Or was the prosecution weaving a story too compelling to ignore? As the trial dragged on, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew unbearable. Each side threw accusations like daggers, each piece of evidence was dissected under a microscope. And yet, beneath the surface of legal arguments and cross-examinations, there was a chilling undercurrent. Emily's voice, echoing through her diary, refusing to be silenced. The climax came when the prosecution revealed one final piece of evidence, the recovered audio recording from Emily's phone. The room froze as her trembling voice filled the speakers, whispering, "He's outside. I think he's watching me," followed by a sharp knock and then silence. Gasps erupted. The defense scrambled to dismiss it as paranoia, but the damage was done. The jury's faces told the story, pale, tense, their eyes locked on the defendant who now sat hunched over, sweat beading on his forehead. The mask was gone. The courtroom could see him for who he truly was. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room emptied into hushed chaos. Outside, reporters swarmed, speculating about the verdict, while inside the defendant sat alone, his lawyer whispering futile reassurances. Hours passed. Then the jury returned. The foreman's voice was steady, but the words carried the weight of finality. "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted, some in tears, others in relief. The defendant's face twisted in rage, his composure gone as deputies moved in to restrain him. He screamed protests, his voice breaking into something raw, animalistic, as if the truth he had hidden so carefully had finally clawed its way into the light. The judge struck his gavel, sentencing him to life without parole. The sound of the gavel was like a coffin lid slamming shut. Emily's family wept openly, clutching each other, knowing that justice, though imperfect, had at least given them some measure of closure. But as the courtroom emptied, a chilling thought lingered. Justice had been served, yes. But Emily's diary, her last words, were a haunting reminder of the darkness that hides behind familiar faces. The trial was over, but the echoes of her fear would never truly fade. The days after Claire's testimony felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The courtroom had fallen into a hush that no one could quite shake off. Reporters outside whispered about betrayal and obsession, and the story splashed across front pages painted Claire as either a tragic pawn in Rachel's dangerous game or as an accomplice too scared to walk away. Inside the prison walls, Rachel sat stone-faced during hearings, her eyes deadened of emotion, as though nothing around her could touch her anymore. But deep inside, she knew this was the moment everything had turned against her. The prosecution wasted no time. With Claire's words echoing in everyone's minds, they began piecing together Rachel's history like a mosaic of cruelty, manipulation, and hunger for control. Witnesses came forward, neighbors, co-workers, even acquaintances who had only brushed against her orbit, each adding their own unsettling shard to the image of a woman who thrived on dominance. Some remembered strange nights when Rachel seemed to test boundaries, pushing people into uncomfortable situations just to watch how far she could make them bend. Others recalled fleeting encounters that suddenly seemed more sinister in hindsight, the sharp, lingering stares, the casual remarks about how fragile trust could be. The jury, who had sat quietly through days of dry forensic testimony, suddenly leaned in now. This wasn't about Rachel as a puzzle of fingerprints and blood evidence anymore. This was Rachel, the woman, and the woman terrified them. Still, Rachel wasn't without her supporters. Her defense attorney argued tirelessly that Claire's story was self-serving, a desperate attempt to save her own skin by shifting blame. They painted Claire as weak, unreliable, and emotionally unstable. And at moments, that picture seemed to resonate. Claire's tears, her trembling hands, her quivering voice, they made her human, but also made her vulnerable to doubts. Was she telling the truth, or had she rewritten her own role in the nightmare to make herself look less guilty? The defense also leaned on the lack of direct evidence tying Rachel's hands to the darkest acts themselves. Yes, she had influence, yes, she had presence, but influence wasn't murder, they argued. Presence wasn't proof. It was Claire, they reminded the jury, who stood before them and admitted her own hands had carried out acts she now regretted. And that left an unsettling question hanging in the air. If Claire was willing to confess to so much, could she also be lying about Rachel's role in order to secure her freedom? Rachel listened to it all in silence. Not once did she cry or lash out or beg for sympathy. She sat motionless, her chin raised slightly as though she wasn't on trial at all, but rather presiding over a room of lesser beings. Every now and then, though, her mask cracked. A flicker of irritation passed when the prosecutor described her as a puppet master. Her jaw tightened when a witness recounted seeing her and Claire together late one night, whispering with an intensity that made the air around them feel charged. Those cracks were small, but they were enough for the jury to see her for what she was, a woman fighting to maintain control in a place where she had none. Outside the courthouse, the media circus reached a fever pitch. Crowds gathered with signs branding Rachel a monster, a manipulator, a predator of the human mind. Others argued she was being vilified unfairly, that Claire was the real criminal, and Rachel merely a scapegoat. The tension spilled onto streets where strangers argued heatedly about who was truly guilty. For Rachel, every headline, every whispered debate, only fueled the fire that painted her as something more than human, something darker. Claire, meanwhile, seemed to shrink further as the days wore on. She barely lifted her eyes anymore, as though she feared Rachel's gaze even from across the courtroom. She seemed haunted, not just by Rachel's shadow but by her own reflection. And in that fragility, the jury began to see the truth of her words. If Claire had fabricated this story, she wouldn't be unraveling. If she were lying, why did it seem as though she lived with Rachel still looming over her? By the time closing arguments neared, the jury had heard two portraits of Rachel. One was of a manipulator so skilled she could make others carry out her will, leaving no trace of her own hands. The other was of a woman being scapegoated by a desperate accomplice who had everything to lose. Both portraits hung in the jury's minds, and yet, deep down, they knew only one could be true. As Rachel was escorted back to her holding cell one evening, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, she caught her reflection in the glass window of a security door. For the briefest moment she stared at herself. The faintest smile curved across her lips. It wasn't joy or victory. It was defiance. No matter what they believed, no matter what they decided, she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But the cracks were spreading. And soon, everyone would see the whole mask shatter. The trial had dragged on for weeks, but by now the courtroom felt like a coffin where everyone was slowly suffocating. Each day brought new testimonies, new details, and new shadows crawling out of Rachel's past. But now, it wasn't just about witnesses or cold facts. It was about the unraveling of a woman who once seemed untouchable. Rachel still wore her mask of calm indifference, but behind her eyes, something had begun to flicker. Something restless, something dangerous. Her silence, once commanding, had started to feel like a void that begged to be filled. The prosecution knew this and they pushed harder. They wanted Rachel to speak. They wanted her to lose control in front of the jury. Then came the evidence Claire had been too afraid to mention until now, the journals. The police had seized them from Rachel's apartment. Dozens of leather-bound notebooks filled with scrawled handwriting, ink smeared in places as though written in a frenzy. At first glance, they seemed harmless, almost artistic. But when the prosecution began reading passages aloud, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop. They weren't diaries. They were blueprints. Each journal entry described scenarios of control, submission, and destruction. Fantasies so vivid they blurred the line between imagination and intent. Some passages mirrored events that had already happened in frightening detail, while others described things that, chillingly, had yet to occur. Names, places, fragments of conversations, they were all there, pieced together like a road map of Rachel's mind. The defense objected furiously, arguing that these journals were private writings, not evidence of guilt. "We don't convict people for what they think," the attorney spat. But the damage was done. The jury had seen enough. This wasn't just fantasy, it was premeditation. Claire refused to look at the journals. She sat hunched in her seat, hands folded tightly as if in prayer, whispering to herself whenever a passage was read. She already knew what they contained. She had lived them. For Rachel, though, the journals were her final grip on power. When the prosecutor asked if the writings belonged to her, Rachel finally spoke. "Yes," she said. Her voice was calm, deliberate, almost proud. "They're mine." The room froze. The prosecutor pressed further, asking if the journals were fiction or plans. Rachel tilted her head slightly, and for the first time in the trial, a smirk broke across her face. "Does it matter?" The words sliced through the silence like a knife. The jury shifted uncomfortably, and even the judge's gavel didn't shatter the chill that followed. In that moment, Rachel wasn't just a defendant on trial, she was the architect of fear itself, pulling everyone into her web with just 4 words. But what the jury didn't know yet was that the journals weren't complete. The police had only recovered part of the collection. Claire knew this, and so did Rachel. Somewhere, locked away, there were more books. Books that contained not just plans of what had been done, but blueprints for what Rachel wanted to do if she ever walked free. The thought lingered, unspoken, but it hung in the air like a storm cloud. As the trial edged toward its end, the prosecution built their closing argument around one central theme. Rachel wasn't just guilty, she was dangerous. Not dangerous because of what she had done, but because of what she still wanted to do. And yet, through it all, Rachel remained unbroken. Even when the weight of the evidence crushed down on her, even when the jury's eyes burned holes into her, she looked back with the same faint, knowing smile. She had lost control of the narrative, yes, but she had planted a seed of doubt too. And for someone like Rachel, sometimes doubt was more powerful than proof. As the courtroom lights dimmed that evening, and Rachel was led back through the narrow corridors of the courthouse, she whispered something under her breath. The guards couldn't make out the words, but Claire did. "I'm not finished." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't denial. It was a promise. And it sent a shiver through everyone who heard it. The day of the verdict arrived like a storm everyone had been bracing for, yet no one felt ready to face. The courthouse was packed, air heavy with anticipation, fear, and the lingering unease that had grown with every revelation of Rachel's dark world. The jurors filed in, each of them wearing the weight of sleepless nights on their faces. They had been asked to judge not only what Rachel had done, but what she was capable of doing if ever set free. Claire sat rigid in the gallery, her hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles were bone white. Every muscle in her body ached from weeks of tension, but her eyes remained locked on Rachel, watching her, waiting for her to break. But Rachel didn't break. She never did. Dressed in a simple gray prison uniform, she sat upright at the defense table, chains glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. Her expression was unreadable, neither smug nor defeated, as if she had already written the ending long before anyone else knew how the story would unfold. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "Will the foreperson please rise?" A juror stood, holding the verdict slip with trembling hands. The room collectively held its breath. "On the charge of first-degree murder," the foreperson began, voice cracking slightly, "we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The words detonated in the room. Claire gasped sharply, tears filling her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. The prosecutor exhaled, his jaw tightening in grim satisfaction. The defense attorney slumped, defeated. But Rachel only smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't manic. It was small, almost serene, like someone who had just been proven right about something no one else could see. Her lips barely moved, but Claire, watching intently, swore she saw Rachel whisper two words. "Of course." The sentencing was swift. Life without the possibility of parole. The judge's gavel slammed like thunder, final and absolute. And yet it felt anything but final. Because Rachel didn't fight. She didn't scream. She didn't even plead for mercy. Instead, she turned slowly in her chair, letting her eyes sweep across the courtroom until they locked on Claire. For a long, unbearable moment, it was as if the two women were the only people in the room. And then Rachel winked. It wasn't playful. It wasn't mocking. It was a signal. A reminder. A promise. Claire's heart seized in her chest. After the hearing, as Rachel was led away in shackles, the cameras swarmed, reporters shouting questions into the air. But Rachel offered no words to the public. No statements, no apologies. Only silence, and that same knowing smile that had haunted the trial from beginning to end. For Claire, the nightmare should have ended that day. The monster was caged, justice delivered, the system victorious. But as she left the courthouse, her chest tight with relief and dread all tangled together, she couldn't shake the gnawing sensation that this was not the end. Because somewhere out there, more journals were waiting to be found. Somewhere out there, Rachel's unfinished symphony of control and destruction lingered in ink and paper, like seeds planted in soil no one had yet disturbed. And Rachel, locked away, silenced, defeated, hadn't looked like someone who lost. She looked like someone who had set something in motion. As the prison van pulled away, Rachel's silhouette barely visible behind the barred windows, Claire whispered to herself the words she had dreaded for weeks. "She's not done." And deep down she knew she was right.